Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final session of our Spirit Community Engagement at JTS. And as you may be joining us for the first time today, since we have a famed faculty member, but everyone else, you know by now, our spring series is on the space in between thresholds and borders in Jewish life and thought. And it's just been an amazing semester of looking at spaces in between in terms of actual geographic space, identity, time, all kinds of things. So, and I think my takeaway is that maybe we live our lives in general in a marginal space in between that we're always struggling to identify. But our session last week and our session today are both on time, and specifically kind of ritually marked or ritually significant times in the Jewish day. So we're so pleased to have Dr. Rabbi Judith Hauptman teaching us today, Billi, Ivry Professor Emerita of Talmud and Rabbinic Culture at JTS, and Tani will introduce her a little bit more fully shortly. So we do, of course, welcome anyone joining us for the first time today and hope that you continue learning with us. We have an amazing set of sponsors today. We're so grateful. We have three sponsors or sets of sponsors at the Chacham level. Steph and Mary Krieger are sponsoring in memory of their teacher, Rabbi Max Tickton. And Marlene Castle-Curson is sponsoring in recognition of Lynn Feynman and the community engagement team here at JTS. And Rana and Brian Rogal are sponsoring in honor of Professor Hauptman, who inspired Rana's love of Jewish studies many years ago at Camp Vermont in Canada. So we're just tremendously grateful to all of you for your generosity, and it's an amazing way to end the series. And our spring series, our summer series is coming up very soon. Starting on June 5th. It is about change. I'm very excited about it. Our scholars will be exploring religious, political, personal, other kinds of key change throughout Jewish history and life. We're going to be looking at questions like what inspires change, what circumstances are conducive to change, who or what drives change, how do we experience change, how do we adapt to it, what role do Jewish values and ideas play in inspiring us to make change. So we'll be looking at, as with all of our series, a huge range of fields. We'll be talking about prophets in the Bible and how they did or did not persuade people to change, the rabbis as influencers in their time, changing the world, tikkun olam in Kabbalistic thought, modern Yiddish culture and political change, and more. So it really will be a wonderful series. We're excited to have you join us. We'll be sending an email announcement later this week with the link to register. So we hope to see you on June 5th. On that note, I will turn it over to Tani.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format for our session, Dr. Hauptman will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end. You can submit your questions to Rabbi Andelman. She'll select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Hauptman. Since we receive a large number of questions, we'd appreciate it if you could express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing them as well, and we'll also share a link shortly in the chat. So pleased to have Professor Judith Hauptman, Billi, Ivry Professor Emerita of Talmud and Rabbinic Culture at JTS. Dr. Hauptman's research focuses on deciphering how the Talmud came into being, as well as investigating women's roles in Judaic thought. And Dr. Hauptman has authored several books in the areas of her research, as well as many influential articles, which you can learn more about in the full bio that we've included in the sources. And I'm so pleased to turn it over to Dr. Hauptman.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm working on an article right now on Kiddush and Havdalah, so I'm going to say this at the outset. If you have any comments to make to me about what I'm saying today or about what I don't say today, please send me email at jtsa.edu. All right. Kiddush and Havdalah are rather popular rituals. Neither one of them appears in the Torah. Sabbath in the Torah is a day of commemorating creation of the world by God, ceasing from labor, resting. We're to copy God. That's the focus of the Sabbath in the book of Exodus. And in Deuteronomy, the Sabbath is fourth commandment out of 10. The Sabbath is presented in moral terms. Make sure everyone in your household, including slaves, even animals, gets a day off. There are other places in the Torah outside of the 10 commandments where we read about some Sabbath prohibitions. The very earliest one, I'm pretty sure about this, is with the manna. You don't go out and collect manna on the Sabbath. Instead, you're getting a double portion of manna on Friday to collect, that is. Elsewhere, no kindling fires, no plowing, no harvesting. So just about everywhere where the Torah talks about the Sabbath, yes, and there are sacrifices that to be offered in tabernacle, later in the temple, but the Sabbath is a day of prohibitions. We don't have any clear positive content, clear Sabbath rituals coming to us from the Torah. Now, Isaiah, which we read in the Haftarah and Yom Kippur, the Karata Shabbat Oneg, make the Sabbath a day of delight. It's a fantastic statement. And, Oneg Shabbats are kind of a byword in most synagogues. But what did Isaiah mean by it? He didn't explain. He did a little bit more than that, what I just told you, but not a whole lot. But the rabbis come along, the rabbis of the Talmud, way after the destruction of the Second Temple, not way after, but shortly thereafter, continue for hundreds of years, the rabbis develop rituals and how to experience the holiness of the Sabbath. Let me just remind you that the 10 Commandments, it's either Zachor or Shamor, remember or commemorate, or observe rather. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat Lakadsho, which means commemorate the Sabbath day to sanctify it. It's a great word, Lakadsho, Kodesh, holiness, sanctity, but we need some filling in on how to do that. So that's why today I'm going to be talking about Kiddush and Havdalah and how these rituals developed in the Rabbinic period, and then we can see how they evolved within the Rabbinic period itself. So we're going to share the screen now, and I'm going to begin with Kiddush. Okay, I will wait till you see it. Oh, okay, here it comes. And the earliest reference in rabbinic literature to Kiddush is in the Mishnah. I don't have to see the source of it on screen. And let me just read. This is the chapter 8 of Mishnah Brachot. Yes, Elu Devarim Sheben Beit Shammai Beit Hillel B'Seudah. So Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel are among the earliest rabbis that we have. We call the rabbis of the Mishnah and of the companion volume Tosefta, we call them Tanaim. So the houses of Hillel and Shammai, or Hillel and Shammai themselves, but I don't have them in front of me right here in this text. The houses of Hillel and Shammai, the students and so on, they disagreed about a number of rituals that took place, for the most part, at a Sabbath meal. Seudah is a meal on the Sabbath. Beit Shammai omrim mevarech al hayom, v'achar kach mevarech al hayayin. So Beit Shammai is always listed first, and that house says that there are going to be two blessings that you're going to recite Friday evening. It doesn't say here Friday evening, but it's understood Friday evening. You're first going to bless the day and then bless the wine, and the house of Hillel reverses the order. So I'm not particularly interested in the order right now, but what I want to say is we know what the blessing on wine is. We have that elsewhere quite a lot in rabbinic literature, Borek Guffen. But what does it mean to bless the day? And this is Kiddush in its earliest presentation. It's called the blessing of the day. The full name of Kiddush in this early period of time, and it continues for that matter, is Kiddushat Hayom, the holiness of the day, which we shorten into Kiddush. It's not we who shortened it in these centuries, but in the Talmud, it's already called Kiddush or Kiddush Hayom or Kiddushat Hayom. They all mean the same thing. So here we have a reference that Friday night, you're going to have a cup of wine at the table. You're going to recite a blessing on the wine. By the way, the halacha that the way we do this is according to the house of Hillel. First, we recite the blessing on the wine, and then we have all those words. It's like a paragraph, which is the Kiddush itself. By the way, let me just straighten this out. The word Kiddush these days most often refers to the food that you get to stand around and eat after Sabbath services, usually in the morning, and sometimes Kiddush a Friday night in the synagogue as well. That's a misnomer, okay? Kiddush is not food. Kiddush is a blessing that declares sanctity. So, of course, why do we call it Kiddush? Because at the beginning in the synagogue, you recite the blessings and then you eat, okay? But I'll see you with Kiddush doesn't mean I'll see you with the blessings. It means I'll see you as we take food after we recite the blessings. But coming back to Kiddush here, this is the earliest reference to Kiddush, that at the meal you have a cup of wine and then you recite Mikadesh HaShabbat. Those words, Baruch Atah Adonai, and so on, Mikadesh HaShabbat, those words are right there in the rabbinic literature itself, not exactly in the Mishnah, but in the Tosefta and then in the Gemara that follows. So that's the first reference. But then comes an anecdote, all right? This anecdote is, as you can see, it's in the Tosefta, the companion volume to Mishnah. This anecdote appears in the Tosefta, and I brought it to you in its version in the Tosefta because that's the original version of it, but it also appears, if you look down at K3, okay, it's not yet on screen, don't have to put it on screen. The next text is going to come from the Talmud, okay, it is coming on screen, Psachim 100a. So I just wanted to say that this text from the Tosefta appears in this companion volume to Mishnah called Tosefta from the same period as the Mishnah, but it also was quoted in the Gemara in Psachim 100a. Why that's significant, we'll get to shortly, but here's the anecdote. And many of you may also know about me that I'm particularly interested in anecdotes. This is an anecdote that's earlier than the ones that I wrote about. The ones I wrote about are in the Talmud. We'll see some of those this afternoon as well. Okay, here's the story. Maaseh b'Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel v'Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Yossi. There's these three rabbis. Hayu mesubin ba'ako. They're reclining. They're sitting around having a meal. Little tray tables are being brought out with food in the city of Akko. Akko was a popular place in rabbinic literature. It was the northern boundary of Israel. There's a port in Akko. Rabbis traveled a lot, and there are many anecdotes which take place in Akko. So they're sitting around eating the Kiddush Aleichem Hayom, and the day becomes holy. That means Friday afternoon turned into the Sabbath. In other words, sunset, okay? And these rabbis they began their meal. You know, I say, in my house, we don't begin a Shabbat meal until it's Shabbat, all right? And generally speaking, we eat it in the evening. Whether Shabbat begins at 4 or 7, we usually eat it around 7 or 7:30. But they're having an afternoon meal. It may even be lunchtime, and they're sitting around and, I don't know, chatting and eating, drinking. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, he's a contemporary of these other two rabbis, but he's from the house of Hillel, and he's considered the chief rabbi of the generation. So he says to Rabbi Yossi, "Rebbe ritzoncha nafsik l'Shabbat." So he says, maybe now that we see it's getting dark, maybe we should stop our meal, remove the tray table with the food on it, recite our blessings. I'm going to call them Kiddush, although I'm not sure they called it Kiddush as early a time as this. Should we do that? He says to Rabbi Yossi, stop everything and acknowledge Shabbat. Amarlo, okay, so now he says to Rabbi Yossi, should we do that? Amarlo, Rabbi Yossi says to him, responds, B'chol yom atam chabev dvarai b'fnei Yehuda, v'achshav atam chabev divrei Yehuda b'fanai. This is, and we need a psychologist to understand this more. I will not comment on the psychological issues here. But this Rabbi Yossi says to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who said to him, why don't we stop and acknowledge Shabbos? How can you do that? Rabbi Yehuda and I and you, the three of us are sitting around, and you know, I'm adding now, that Rabbi Yehuda and I, Rabbi Yossi, are in competition with each other. We're rivals. And generally speaking, you favor my opinion, he says here, my opinion, Rabbi Yossi's opinion, over Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Are you trying to humiliate me, is what he's saying here? And in the presence of Rabbi Yehuda, you're going to favor his opinion instead of my opinion, which you generally do favor. And then he quotes from the book of Esther. I'm not going to go into that. You can figure that out on your own. Are you going to conquer the queen with me in the house? It's a reference to Haman and Achashverosh and so on. that's what Rabbi Yossi said to Rabban Gamliel. And Rabban Gamliel Amar la, Rabban Gamliel responds, Im kain lo nafsik shema tikava halacha l'dorot. So having been, so to speak, dressed down by his colleague, by Rabbi Yossi's kind of sharp comment back to the retort to Rabban Shimon Gamliel, Rabban Shimon Gamliel says, fine, oh, you're right, or I give in to you, and we're not going to stop. We're not going to stop eating. We're not going to remove the food, which is what Rabbi Yehuda would recommend at this point. We are going to keep eating our meal, and at the end of the meal, I'm adding that in, but that's implied here, at the end of the meal, we're going to recite Kiddush. So in that way, he satisfies the ego, we might say, of Rabbi Yossi, who complained that his view was not being upheld. All right, and then there's a little addendum here. Amru, it was reported, lo zazu misham ad shekavu halacha Rabbi Yossi. Nobody budged, meaning from that, at that moment, the halacha of this, what do you do when Shabbat begins in the middle of a meal? It was decided like Rabbi Yossi, you just finish your meal and then you recite Kiddush. All right, this chapter, Psachim, is often taught to beginning Talmud students. I have taught it a number of times to my students at JTS, and I never really paid attention to what I'm about to tell you now because I was too concerned with, oh, what does this have to do with Pesach? And we say Kiddush at the beginning of the Seder, and let's talk about that, and so on. But I want to show you the difference between the source I just read, K2, and the source that's coming up, K3. So now we go to K3, and what I'm indicating to you right now is in the Gemara, in Tractate Psachim, that story that we just read with the three rabbis is brought on the page, appears on 100A, and immediately following that story, we get K3. Okay, as I say, I didn't do it that way on the handout because I wanted to give you the original text from the Tosefta, but there are very few differences between how it's presented in one book and another. All right, K3. We're going now in post-Tanaitic. We're now in the period of the Gemara, post-Mishnaic, meaning 200 years, 225, or around there. We don't know exactly. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Okay, Shmuel. Oh yes, I indicated in the Talmudic text the generation and the location of the rabbis. So when it says Rabbi Judah BA2, he's Babylonian Mora of the second generation, and he is stating something that he learned from his teacher, Shmuel, who doesn't go by rabbi, just goes by Shmuel, who's a Babylonian Mora of the first generation, and you'll see JA elsewhere. That would be Jerusalem Amora. Okay, so what did Shmuel say that his student Rabbi Yehuda is telling us? Ein halacha lo k'Rabbi Yehuda v'lo k'Rabbi Yossi ela pares mapa umekadesh. So, as I say, the story that we just read in K2 ended with they fixed the halacha according to Rabbi Yossi, and now shortly thereafter, shall we say, 20 years, 30 years, shortly thereafter, you know, when a halacha is fixed, it's fixed, meaning it's set, it doesn't usually change. And I want all of you to be shocked because it now says, Shmuel is saying, no, the halacha is not fixed, not like Rabbi Yehuda, not like Rabbi Yossi, but here's what we're going to do. If we're sitting around Friday afternoon and sundown happens and it's now Shabbos, what do? Not what Rabbi Yossi said, which is finish the meal and recite Kiddush afterwards. We're going to spread a cloth. In modern Hebrew, mapah is a tablecloth that actually works for us too, except they didn't have real tables. They had little tray tables. You spread a cloth and you recite Kiddush, meaning you're having a meal and in front of each participant of the meal is a small tray table with food on it. It could be appetizers, it could be main dish, it doesn't matter. And it's time and it's sunset. And what do? You don't finish your meal, nor, which is what Rabbi Yossi say, nor do you remove the little tray table and say Kiddush and bring it back. No, you just cover the food with a cloth, all right? And as you see, I gave you 12th century Tosefist comment here, Rashbam, the grandson of Rashi, that this seems to be the origin of the challah cover. You know, a lot of us say, what is the point of the challah cover? Not to embarrass the challah, because Kiddush comes first and the challah shouldn't be embarrassed. By the way, that is not like just made up. That does appear in our Jewish texts. But, and I happen to think it's sweet, but I do believe this is the real origin. So what's being said here, which I find extremely interesting, is when Shabbos begins, you stop what you're doing. If you're sitting around eating, you stop eating, you spread a cloth over the food, you recite Kiddush. As soon as you notice it's Shabbos, you recite Kiddush, and then, so to speak, magically, you remove the cover from the food. And you know what? It is now a Sabbath meal because you recited Kiddush. The food wasn't there. It was covered up, okay? So you recited Kiddush and you uncover the food. It's the same food you were eating before. It could even be half eaten, doesn't matter. But it is now Shabbos, a Shabbos meal. Okay, that is what Shmuel was saying. He didn't like either of the rusas, either of the recommendations of his predecessors. And he says, this is what we do, Pares Ma'apal Mekadesh. And of course, that is what we do. Today, well, most of us are not eating Shabbat afternoon and then covering the challah and uncovering it. Most of us begin the meal in the evening. But this is how you solve the problem in society in which the afternoon meal or a long lunch or a late lunch happened a lot earlier. So I think this is a very interesting example of change. I gather that changes the topic of the next series of lectures. But this to me is a clear example, extremely clear example of change in the Talmudic period. But the point I'm trying to make is it's acknowledging the sanctity of the Sabbath. It's what we did, what happened just now in these two texts, in text number 2, K2, what are they doing when they eat, and when they finish eating? Oh yes, we're acknowledging the Sabbath has arrived. But in K3, I'm claiming what they're really doing, because they're stopping as soon as the Sabbath begins and reciting Mikadesh Shabbat. But the rest of that paragraph came later. When they're reciting Mikadesh Shabbat, more or less at sundown, what they're doing is not just declaring that the Sabbath has arrived, but saying we are now stepping into the sanctity of the Sabbath. We are acknowledging that the Sabbath is sanctified time. It's a different dimension of time from what we have lived in up until now. And by uttering these words, we are changing our mental orientation, our spiritual orientation. We are going to feel the Sabbath. And of course, the food we're about to eat, which is already on the table, is going to be a Sabbath meal. So that's how I understand what's happening between K2 and K3, all right? But to move along, K4, the next text, is a brief statement, I won't even read it, that just says that not only do we recite Kiddush, Kiddushat Hayom at the meal, which is something we're pretty familiar with today, but we recite Kiddushat Hayom in shul on Shabbat. Now, if you go to shul Friday night, or even if you go to shul Shabbat morning, what you will discover is, unlike the 18 blessings or 19, whatever number, of the Amidah, the standing prayers that we have during the week, on Shabbat and on festivals, there are the same 3 opening blessings, the same 3 closing blessings, but in the middle, the 12 or 13 petitions are replaced with just one paragraph, and that paragraph ends Mikadesh Shabbat. So the interesting thing, which I'm going to talk about more when we get to Havdalah, is you recite Kiddush twice, all right? Whether you say Ma'ariv in shul, or whether you say it at home, or whether you don't say it at all, but okay, we're talking about people who are doing it. Kiddush is recited twice. Okay, you can talk about Kiddush in the daytime. We'll get to that in a moment. But Friday night, you acknowledge the sanctity, you step into the sanctity of the Sabbath in the synagogue, in the middle blessing of the Amidah ends Mekadesh Shabbat, and all the rest of the Amidot on Shabbat similarly have 3 and 3, and the middle blessing is Mekadesh Shabbat. But you're Mekadeshing Shabbat Friday night, because that's when you're bringing in and stepping into the sanctity. So I'm just pointing that out because we'll compare it later with Havdalah, but Kiddush in prayer and at home. All right, and now we get to another anecdote. This is in the Gemara. Bayom my mevarech. So I think most of us know that if you go to shul on Shabbat morning, the service is going to end with Kiddush, or you go downstairs and somebody's going to recite Kiddush before you partake of food. So the Gemara asks, and what do you recite in the daytime? why is this question being asked? Because on Shabbat day, you're not, for the first time, stepping into the holiness of the sanctity. You've already been living in that sanctity and experiencing it from Friday night. So what's this thing about reciting Kiddush in the daytime? Amar Rav Yehuda, Borek Briagafen. There's no Mikadesh Shabbat at the Kiddush on Shabbat. All you do, because it wouldn't make sense to say Mikadesh Shabbat, although I admit we say it in the Tefillot, in the prayers. So Rabbi Yehuda says, there's no second paragraph that we recite Friday night. You don't recite Shabbat daytime. Borek Briagafen. But here's the anecdote. I think most of you know that, generally speaking, in shul, it's not just Borek Briagafen. Okay, Rav Ashi Ikla Mechoza. Rav Ashi is among the latest Babylonian Amoraim rabbis, and he's visiting Mechoza, big town, and the understanding is he's spending Shabbos. I don't know exactly with whom, but rabbis dropped in on one another, unexpected, expected, and were Shabbat guests. So he's in this big town, Amrule, and he's apparently sitting around with people, daytime on Shabbat, and they say to him, they know that he's Rav Ashi, the Kadesh Lan Mar Kiddusha Rabbah. Let the master, Mar is the master, it's a nice way of referring to Rav Ashi, not by his name. Let the master recite Kiddush for us, but which Kiddush are they asking him for? The Kiddusha Rabbah. Kiddusha is Kiddush and Rabbah is great. So basically they're saying to Rav Ashi, I mean, I could imagine, here you are, a guest in a synagogue, and they come over to you and they're asking you to lead a ritual. And then you say to yourself, what are they talking about? And okay, so they say to him, recite for us the Kiddusha Rabbah, Havdalah, and they give it to him, meaning they give him a cup of wine. Savar, my nehu Kiddusha Rabbah. And he says to himself, what is this Kiddusha Rabbah that they're asking me to recite? And then he continues and talks to himself, Amar, to himself, Mifti, Kol HaBrachot Kulan Borek Briagafen, Amre Beresha. He says, in general, when you have a ritual, like a bris or like Birkat Hamazon and so on, or the brachot that you say after meal, you begin with Borek Briagafen, that comes first, and then you go on to the other blessings. Amar, so he said, you always begin with Borek Briagafen, so I'll begin with Borek Briagafen and we'll see what's what, because he doesn't know what they want from him. Amar Borek Briagafen, va'agid be. And he kind of stretches it out, the words of Borek Briagafen, and he's looking around, Chazieh, and he sees him, Lahahu Saba, he sees that old man, the Gachin Bishate, who leans over and picks up and he drinks a cup of wine. And he realizes, okay, I think you get it, he realizes that's Kiddusha Rabbah. He didn't know what Kiddusha Rabbah was that they asked him to recite, but all he did was say Borek Briagafen, and somebody's already drinking wine, somebody who knows, who's there every week, let's say. And so Rav Ashi says about himself, Karei Anafshe, Hechacham Einav B'Rosho. And this is just a little patting himself on the back. A wise person, his eyes are in his head, meaning sometimes it's better to remain silent and look around and see what's happening, and then you can gather what your next step is by looking carefully at what people are doing. So my point, of course, is not so much to analyze what's going on with Rav Ashi, but to say it looks as if the people themselves, in this case, it happens to be the people of Mechoza, but as I say, it's a large Jewish community there, people themselves have produced a Kiddush to recite daytime on Shabbat, and this is the origin of it. In other words, it didn't come to us from the house of Shammai or house of Hillel or those rabbis who were sitting around. It's like a brand new ritual, or at least the editor of the Talmud who records the story for us is treating it as never heard of this one before, but here it is, and this is what we do. So now if you're going to say to yourself, but we know that in shul, on Saturday morning in shul, at the end, they don't just recite Borek Briagafen. There are always a couple of verses. Well, yes, because Jews are never satisfied with just a short blessing when you can have a longer blessing. Jews love to add psukim. So what's pretty standard now is you say V'shamru b'nei Yisrael Shabbat. You take verses that the Torah talks about, observing the Sabbath. You recite those verses. Those are just verses. They're not a prayer or a blessing. The verses, and then you say Barak Ragafen. But there's no paragraph at Kiddush at Shabbat, on daytime Shabbat. There's no paragraph at a meal or at food in the synagogue where you say Mekadesh Shabbat. You do say Mekadesh Shabbat in the the Amidah, but you don't say it here. Okay, and finally, the last text on Kiddush is about women. And I of course, have I used this text about women many, many times in the past? Yes, I have, but my goal in the past was always to highlight, well, look at how the rabbis did give women a religious role and on and on and on. So my point today, it's like, I looked at this sort of with fresh eyes. So I'm going to make a different point. It is going to be about women, but it's going to be more about Kiddush than about women. But this is what I call by now a famous text. Amar Rav Adabar Ahava, second generation, Nashim Chayvot b'Kiddush Hayom Dvar Torah. Women are obligated, Kiddush Hayom, that means to Kiddush. And he's talking Friday night now, the real Kiddush. Women are obligated to Kiddush. Dvar Torah, this is quite astounding. He says that from the Torah, it is a rule of Torah, or is a word of Torah, that women, meaning women like men, are obligated to Kiddush, meaning either to recite Kiddush themselves, to hear somebody else's Kiddush, or, this is, again, not my point here today, but I have to say it anyway, or a woman may recite a Kiddush for a man, and if he says Amen, she has fulfilled his obligation, as long as he says Amen, to recite Kiddush, because when people are equally obligated, when women have the exact same level of obligation as men do, of course, I'm all in favor of halacha change over time, but ignoring that for now. According to the Gemara, and there's actually more about this in Brachot 20, a woman may recite Kiddush for her husband. It says that explicitly in the Talmud. And in case you're interested, the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, says it black on white. And I often have told over the years, my rabbinical students memorize that paragraph of the Shulchan Aruch. So should you ever be at a Hillel on campus or visiting people or whatever it is, and you want to have a woman recite Kiddush, and that she should be the only person, not a man is not going to recite after her, and should they challenge you, especially if people from the right are going to challenge you, just have that in your pocket, meaning memorize, and you just say, Shulchan Aruch paragraph, don't ask me now because I don't remember. Just cite that paragraph from the Shulchan Aruch, and that ends all arguments. It's black on white. Women may recite Kiddush for a man. Of course, they prefer men, but that's not the issue. May a woman recite Kiddush for a man and thereby fulfill his obligations? Yes. So now I don't want to get lost on my point. My point is this. When I was thinking about Kiddush and its evolution over time, I said to myself, of all the mitzvot, why did the rabbis deviate from their own rules that in general, there are exceptions, that in general, women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvah, mitzvah that must be performed in a specific time, and it's an action that you have to take. Kiddush is clearly one of them. I said to myself, why? Why did they do this? All right. So the answer kind of is right here. I left out a piece of it, but I only brought the part that matters for us today. Elam Mar Rabba, he's a later rabbi here. Amar Kra Zachor b'Shamor. Zachor is the first word of the Ten Commandments in Exodus. Shamor, to observe, is in Deuteronomy. And here comes the interesting argument. Kol sheyeshno b'shmira, yeshno b'schira. Anybody who's obligated to observe the Sabbath is similarly obligated to utter words of commemoration of the Sabbath. Meaning, if you are somebody who has to refrain from work on the Sabbath, then you are obligated to commemorate the Sabbath, meaning by uttering those words of Kiddush. V'hanei nashi, and these women, meaning women, ho'il v'itnahu b'shmira, itnahu b'schira. And since women are obligated, just like men, of course, to observe the Sabbath, to refrain from all those activities that are forbidden to perform on the Sabbath, they are similarly obligated to commemorate the Sabbath, meaning with Kiddush. So my point here is, if the rabbis made an exception to their own rules and obligated women to say Kiddush, I think that is their way of telling us the importance that they attach to Kiddush and how they see Kiddush as so important, so determinative in one's observance of the Sabbath. Okay, I'm going to give an analogy now, analogies are never perfect, but the analogy I'm going to give right now is from my own life. I turned 80, the age of 80 yesterday, and I got a lot of happy birthdays on Facebook and from relatives and friends and so on. Had the day gone by without anybody acknowledging that it was my birthday, yes, it would have been my birthday. Would I have been in a very great mood and celebratory? But all that acknowledgement of the day of that time yesterday being special to me, they enabled me to glorify, to love every second of my birthday. And I grant you that's not exactly like Kiddush, but that's what the rabbis are saying here. You don't just roll into Kiddush. Oh, it's sundown, now it's the Sabbath. I'll just keep reading the same book I was reading before. No, you stop what you're doing and you recite Kiddush, and that enables you, I like to use the word acute, to acutely experience the sanctity of the Sabbath. We create sanctity with words. We acknowledge that sanctity has begun now. You can't see sanctity, you can't touch sanctity, but you can do a speech act. You can get words of sanctity out of your mouth. And in that way, you're in a different frame of mind, using Heschel's expression. You enter that palace of time, you enter the Sabbath, all right? That is how I understand over the generations what these rabbis are doing for us. Okay, we will now break shortly for Q&A.
All right, thank you. Well, needless to say, the chat is full of birthday wishes for you. And actually there were birthday wishes coming in before you even said that. So I don't know, the word is out.
Okay.
But, what a blessing for the Jewish world that we have you here, and that we've had you here for 80 years. All right, so the first several questions were about candlelighting and how that, especially in the story. Are you not hearing me?
What was that first one? The group of questions is about what?
It's about lighting candles.
Oh, candles.
And
okay.
in this story where we sort of smudge into Shabbat over the course of this meal, or the rabbis do, how might candlelighting have figured in? And people also were making connections between the covering of the challah, the covering of the eyes, and sort of
Okay.
there.
Okay. In my notes, what I did not say, although it's in my notes, is Kiddush is just one of the rituals which the rabbis introduced to so to speak, beef up, to get us to experience the Sabbath. Again, the Karatala Shabbat Oneg, you want to make the Sabbath a day of delight. So Friday night, what they talk about, the Tractate of the Sabbath has 23 or 24 chapters to it. The first 6 are about preparing for the Sabbath. And chapter 2 is all about lighting candles. The idea being Friday night, you should have a lavish meal. And even on Shabbat daytime, there are ways of keeping the food hot. They're very detailed, and you can't keep light a flame to keep your food hot on Shabbat, to heat it up. But there are ways of burying it in the ground and so on and so on. So food becomes very important for the rabbis. They actually prescribe 3 meals to eat on the Sabbath. You have to figure out exactly which those 3 are. I'm not going to comment on that. Some rabbis say 4. But yes, candles are very important because we're going to drink wine. We're going to eat our meal by candlelight. It's going to be dark. It's most likely going to have meat, and it's going to be lavish. It's, like a Sabbath banquet. Okay. And they even talk about putting on a different set of clothing to welcome the Sabbath. And there are wonderful anecdotes, which I won't tell right now, about how different rabbis actually went into the kitchen to help prepare for the Sabbath. Generally speaking, it's the women who are in the kitchen preparing for the Sabbath. So yes, a meal with wine by candlelight, champagne, flutes, candlelight, and so on. That's definitely part of the Sabbath observance that the rabbis are suggesting. Yes. So what else? What was the other thing that you mentioned, Julie?
About the covering of the eyes and sort of different reasons we might be
covering the eyes. Covering the eyes is something totally separate. I know cover the challah. It sounds like cover the eyes. No, usually, let's say you want to eat a piece of bread. So first you recite the motzi, then you eat the piece of bread. That's the normal order of things. The blessing is recited before you experience, before you act on whatever the blessing is about. But you can't do that Friday night, because if you recite the blessing and then strike the match, reciting that blessing, whoever is reciting the blessing, is already welcoming the Sabbath. So you can't recite the blessing on the candles, Shabbat, and then strike the match. So what you do is you light the candles first, and then you cover your eyes as kind of a pretense. Oh, I haven't lit those candles. Okay, and then you cover the eyes, you recite the blessing, and then you remove your eyes, and now it's as if you just lit those candles following reciting the blessing. That's the reason we do it like that. Of course, artists now have, particularly, they depict women lighting Shabbat candles, maybe covering their eyes, covering their head, even covering the challah. I don't want to bring in, they're totally separate. But it's because of the reversal of actions that you cover your eyes. So it's as if, oh, now I'm lighting the candles. Oh, yes, there they are, beautiful light. Okay. All right.
I think it's, I mean, I really never noticed it until people started saying it. The fact that in a short span on Friday night, we're covering, first our eyes, then the challah twice, to kind of say it's not exactly this, it's like that, or sort of, to kind of, I mean, it's symbolic, but
yes,
it's an interesting sort of pretend.
Yes, it is interesting. You're right. In that way, they are similar. That's right.
Okay, we had a question also about, I know you mentioned the fact that we repeat the same blessing, the Kadesh Shabbat, in the services on Shabbat and in all of them. And I'm not sure if you elaborated, but right, so you dispelled, we don't have a problem with saying it again at Shabbat lunch, because it turns out we're not saying it again. We're just saying Borei Pri Hagafen over the wine. But are those recitations during all of that, all of those prayers on Shabbat, are they not, well, one person said, why are they not a blessing in vain? They're certainly not marking it at the beginning. What are they doing? What are they doing there?
We're going to be inconsistent. What are they doing? In each of the Amidot, we're going to still, the middle blessing is, whether it's Friday night or Shabbat Shacharit or Shabbat Musaf or Mincha, it's always going to be Mekadesh Shabbat. And no, I'm not going to call it, do I think there's logically, does it not really make a lot of sense to keep saying Mekadesh Shabbat on Shabbat if I'm claiming that these are the words that welcome the Sabbath and help us experience the Sabbath? When you say Mekadesh Shabbat morning and so on, it doesn't really have the same meaning or effect that it has when you say it Friday night. Okay, so they didn't change it. Like, I have nothing more to say. I have no defense except to say, you keep repeating it. Okay, we'll figure this out. It reminds you that you're experiencing the holiness of Shabbat. It helps you, and so on and so on. But the Friday night Kiddush, both in the Ma'ariv service and in the Kiddush of a wine at home, it's called Al Bitfilah and Al Hakos on a cup. Those are the terms that Talmud uses. Those are the meaningful, the times that we say Kiddush when it actually is Mikadesh, when it's actually acknowledging and bringing in sanctity.
Right. So the wine kind of elevates that particular recitation, and the fact that it's at the beginning. I certainly agree with you. Experientially, it's totally different. Someone pointed out we also say it again at the end of the Haftarah. We do the same thing on holidays. We say
that's right.
The blessing over holidays. All of these slots. But you're right. It feels very different.
Yeah.
Do you want to take one more, or do you want to go on?
Yeah, but first of all, I just want to say these questions are excellent questions. Okay, I'll take one more. Yeah, I think
we have great people who learn with us. The question was about the verses that precede Friday night Kiddush. And kind of
Okay.
how, when, why were those added? What
Yeah.
role did they play?
Okay, those verses, Vayer, Vayivoker, Yom HaShishi, they're post-Talmudic. As far as I know, they're even post-Gaonic. I think they're, I don't know, 500-600 years old. And they were added, okay, Kiddush can be recited standing or sitting. There's no absolute necessity to stand, although many of us do stand to recite Kiddush. But those verses, which are kind of testifying, witnessing, acknowledging that God created the world, that on the seventh day, God created the world in 6 days and then rested on the seventh, refrained from active work on the seventh. Those were added, again, if you look at Havdalah, I'm not going to talk about this afterwards, I'll just say it right now. Havdalah is really the blessings. You've got 4 blessings there, Yud, Bet, Nun, Hey, Yayin, and so on. But we have 9 verses, 10 verses, 12 verses in Sephardic prayer books. It's different from Ashkenazic prayer books. We just love to make things longer, and we love our Bible, and we love reciting verses from our Bible. So those verses that we recite Friday night, I'll say 1 or 2 more things about it right now. But those are not originally part of Kiddush. They don't actually play a role. Kiddush begins with a Baruch Pri Hagafen, Baruch Atah, so Baruch Pri Hagafen, and the paragraph Mikadesh HaShabbat that follows Baruch Pri Hagafen, that is Kiddush. The verses that precede are simply verses that precede, which makes sense because they're telling you about the first time Shabbat is mentioned in Jewish history, which is in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. And then, there's that little problem with Yom HaShishi. It's Vayer Vayivoker Yom HaShishi. We're really not talking about Yom HaShishi in Kiddush. It really begins with the next verse that talks about the Sabbath. But there's an acronym here, Yom HaShishi Vayichulu HaShamayim. It's Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. If you look at the first letters of Yom HaShishi Vayichulu HaShamayim. So again, we're getting into Jewish mysticism, which is not my area. And so people say they begin the Kiddush with Yom HaShishi, but it's not nice to begin with just 2 words from the end of a verse. So you begin with Vayer Vayivoker kind of quietly, and then Yom HaShishi Vayichulu HaShamayim out loud to get in that God's name in there. Finished. Okay, that's all I have to say. As I said, I'm talking about changes and evolution of Jewish rituals in the period of the Talmud, but just because the Talmudic period ended doesn't mean that Jews stop having their rituals evolve. And they keep going, and more verses all the time. Okay.
I think it's a it's sort of a helpful reminder, right here. Here's sort of why we're doing this. You made me think about, I've been counting the Omer with my son every night since Pesach. We're nearing the end, and we say the verses from the Torah about counting the Omer before we do it. Otherwise, there's not that you have to, but there's sort of a randomness to it. There's just we're saying a blessing on counting, and then we count, as opposed to kind of the context of the Torah context of it, which maybe there's something of that there too, elevating it to this to connecting every Shabbat to creation.
Yes, it definitely does connect every Shabbat to creation. Zachor and Shamor are not even actually mentioned explicitly there, right? Do we say Zachor Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho?
In the daytime.
That. In the daytime, yes, in the daytime. So yes, so at night we're reminded of the creation, the first Sabbath. Okay, I will now continue with Havdalah.
Great.
There are more texts on Havdalah than there were on Kiddush, so we're going to move along at a rapid clip. Okay, again, my point here is to look at how the ritual of Havdalah developed over the Rabbinic period, from the beginning of the Rabbinic period to the end of the Rabbinic period, roughly from the beginning of one common era through 500, 600 years following. Okay, so this first text is just telling you, as we saw with Kiddush, that you say, oh no, I have to talk about this first text. Okay, Maskirin, and then I left out deliberately a couple of words, V'Havdalah b'chonen hadat. So we're gonna say Havdalah in the Amidah. In other words, Shabbat is ending, and you're going to, in Shabbat Ma'ariv, at the end of Shabbat, you acknowledge the exit of Shabbat. The word Havdalah means separation or distinction. I prefer distinction. So distinction means we are distinguishing between the holiness of the Sabbath and the ordinariness, the wholeness. Whole is the weekdays, the distinction between Shabbat and the rest of the week. In other words, we welcome the Shabbat with Kiddush. We acknowledge the holiness into which we are entering, and we will experience it for 24 or now 25 hours. And then we, at the end of it, we're saying goodbye, so to speak. We're acknowledging the holiness has ended, and now we go back to the work week. That's important too, to acknowledge the end of it, not just the beginning of it. All right, and they have actually more to say. The rabbis have more to say about Havdalah than they do about Kiddush. All right, so there's a dispute here. You put Havdalah into that Honen Hada'at blessing. That's the fourth blessing of the Amidah. But then we have two dissenting opinions. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Omra bracha revi'it b'fnei atzma. He says, no, Havdalah should be its own paragraph. He's calling it a blessing. He's using that term loosely here. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, not in Chonen Hada'at and not as its own paragraph. By the way, if you make it its own paragraph, you're going to wind up with 19 or even 20 blessings, but Rabbi Akiva doesn't seem to bother him. And Rabbi Eliezer is saying, we acknowledge the exit of Shabbat in the Hoda'ah. That's the last set of blessings, the last three blessings, from recite and so on. You slip Havdalah somewhere into there. That didn't become halacha, so exactly how he would have done it, I don't know. But I just gave you this text to show you Havdalah is recited in Ma'ariv. It's in prayer. The way Kiddush is in prayer, Havdalah is in prayer. Okay, H2, the next text. This is from the Tosefta, companion bound to Mishnah again. Shabbat. You come home, enter your home at the end of Sabbath has ended. And what do? Now, there's an assumption here. I didn't give you the rest of the paragraph, but there's an assumption you're going to have a meal. Yeah, Jews and food, they go together. Okay, you're going to have a meal. So what you're going to do is Mevarech al Hayayin, recite a blessing on wine, obviously Bar Guffen. Al Hama'or, this means on light, meaning you couldn't strike a match on the Sabbath, but now you can because the Sabbath is over. So we have the blessing Borei Moreh Ha'esh. Those words, I don't believe they're in the Talmud, but I'm not sure about that. I didn't check that. V'yaha b'samim. Now, we just smell some cloves or something, but they actually burned spices for pleasant aroma and so on. You cannot do that on the Sabbath. So you light a match and you have a lamp, oil lamp at the end of the Sabbath, recite a blessing. Now you can resume that. Now you can resume burning your spices. Ve'omer Havdalah. I underline the word ve'omer because the first three, Yayin, are blessings, Baruch Atah and so on. But Havdalah here in the Tosefta, and in the Mishnah for that matter, is just an Omer. You recite Havdalah, meaning it's not a blessing, it doesn't begin Baruch Atah. So for instance, we'll see later, you say the words, for instance, Hamavdil Be. The Sabbath and the rest of the week. But it's not a Havdalah blessing, and what you're not seeing here is a complete Havdalah ritual, but I think it should be very clear to you that the word Havdalah here is not a term that's a collective term for several blessings, the way it is today, the Yud Bet Nun Hey, 4 blessings. No, you have Yayin, you have Ma'or, you have Besamim, and then you say Havdalah. You acknowledge that Sabbath is over. Okay, I'm going on to the third one, and I'm just going to say this is the Mishnah. The word mazon is here. Here we have again, the houses are in dispute about the order of blessings to be recited at the end of the Sabbath. I'm not going to mention, you can see for yourself, they have a slightly different, they put up, both of them have Havdalah at the very end. That's what I wanted you to see. Because Havdalah is not a blessing. It's just a declaration. So, but they also include the word mazon here. So that's birkat hamazon. That's grace after meals. So there's Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Okay, this is Mishnah Brachot, chapter 8. If you go back to Mishnah Brachot, the second one, it says there, I think we actually had it here. Yes, you don't have to go back, but in the opening of chapter 8 of Masechet Brachot, Mishnah Brachot, it says, these are the disputes that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel have regarding a meal. So I just want to say that at this point, Havdalah is being recited along with other blessings at the end of a meal, grace mazon, birkat hamazon, grace after meals, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We'll see a different text later. All right. So the Havdalah that we know today, which is 4 blessings in a row, preceded by verses, followed by Eliyahu Hanavi and so on, which is not a verse, it's a song. That Havdalah, well-developed ritual, that's not what you see here. Here you just see, if you have a meal at the end of the Sabbath and you're going to recite birkat hamazon, this is how you do it, and Havdalah comes at the end. Okay, next text, H4. Now we're getting into something much more complicated. That's a citation from the Mishnah that Havdalah should be recited in the 4th blessing, in the Chonen Hadat blessing. But interestingly enough, as we saw in the Mishnah, which was text number something, H1 or something, yes, the rabbis were disagreeing about how to include Havdalah in the Ma'arif prayer, in the Amidah of Ma'arif. So now we're going to the Talmud Yerushalmi, okay, it's Land of Israel Talmud, more or less contemporary with the Bavli, although it concludes sooner. What's the commentary that they have on that Mishnah, add Havdalah to the blessing Chonen Hadat? All right, I'm going to read some of this line by line. Shimon Barba Ba'a Kome Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is going to figure in a lot of these paragraphs. He asked Rabbi Yochanan, Davar Shehu Nohegu Va. We've got an established ritual, meaning he's saying to his superior, Shimon Barba is younger than Rabbi Yochanan, so it's a junior scholar talking to a senior scholar. He's saying, we've got an established ritual from, the words are not here, but I'm going to add them, from time immemorial. Okay, it's not time immemorial. It's an already established ritual, this Havdalah in prayer. That's what we're talking about, that those words that we add in the Amidah that familiar with today, but they're disputing it then. He's saying, how can sages dispute where to put the Havdalah statement, declaration, statement of distinction in the Amidah? What does it mean that they're disputing it? This Havdalah ritual way precedes them, generations earlier. We've been doing Havdalah in the Amidah, and we'll talk about it at home also shortly. So how can they dispute something that people have been doing for ages? All right, doesn't make sense. And the answer he gets is, Amarlo al yadeshi karabakos shleichuha batfilah. So Rabbi Yochanan says to the interlocutor here, since the primary obligation to recite Havdalah is on a cup, meaning a cup of wine at home, they forgot how to do it, meaning where to insert it or maybe even what words to use in the Ma'ariv, in the Ma'ariv Amidah. Now, I'm not going to say I understand this fully, but what Rabbi Yochanan seems to say here is, yes, we recite Havdalah twice, but the primary recitation of Havdalah is the one you do at home, and that's the one that's being done regularly. And the second one, okay, they forgot where to insert it in tefillah, meaning it's an old enough ritual. I'm going to fall over my words here because this is not because I don't know, but because I think the statement is hard. Yes, we're going to say Havdalah twice. The one at home is more primary. The one in tefillah, other rabbis are going to disagree with this. The one in tefillah is secondary obligation. But since people are, I don't know, more observant of Havdalah in the home, and it's just that line now, it's not the whole series of blessings, then when it came to tefillah, these rabbis who lived in the Talmudic period, these rabbis are post-Talmudic rabbis in the Gemara period. So they forgot. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on that. Miltei Amara sheikara bakos. So Rabbi Yochanan has revealed his opinion. Miltei is his thing. His opinion is that the primary obligation of Havdalah is on a cup of wine. But we're not finished. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, B'Shem Rabbi Yitzchak Ruba, I'm not going to comment on the names. He says, Amara bakos, Amara b'tfilah, b'shvil lezakot et hatinokot. So again, he's acknowledging that you're going to say Havdalah twice. And he says, if you say it, Havdalah on a cup of wine at home, you still have to say it in tefillah, in the ma'ariv, because why are you saying it at home? To let the kids hear. By the way, I'm going to comment on the women in just a moment. You're saying Havdalah at home, not for your own needs, but really so that the children hear Havdalah. Tinokot is not babies, it's children in the Talmud. Today, Tinok means baby. And then Miltei Amarashi Karabba Tefillah. So unlike the first rabbi, unlike Rabbi Yochanan, this rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Ruba, thinks that the primary obligation of Havdalah is in prayer, and what you do at home is not your primary obligation. You do it. You have to do it, but you do it for the kids. I just want to say right now, to digress for a moment, there are many commentators on this Talmud Yerushalmi, and 201, they say, not only children are obligated to hear Havdalah, but women as well, okay? Nowhere in the Talmud is there a statement that women are obligated to Havdalah. To Kiddush, yes. And if you want to make a good argument, you say if they're obligated to Kiddush, which is the beginning, then they should be obligated, understood, they should be obligated to Havdalah. But it doesn't say that. But I'm pleased to report to you that the medieval commentators on this Yerushalmi statement say Tinokot and B'nei Habayit, women are called the kind of people of the house, but Teresa Solibin has made it clear B'nei Betel means wife. All right, but coming back from my feminist pedestal at the moment, so his opinion is that you're going to say Havdalah twice at home for the kids, but your real obligation is in tefillah. And then finally, we get a third opinion. See, it's like they're having problems. They don't. Why is there a dispute about how to do Havdalah and tefillah, given that Havdalah has been going on for a long time? They don't say how long. Rabbi Ze'era, Rabbi Yehuda B'Shem Shmuel, and now we're getting back to the same Shmuel that we saw before. It's a different topic though, but he's an early rabbi in Babylonia. Amara bakos, amara b'tfilah, amara b'tfilah, amara bakos, miltei amara ikara kan v'kan, meaning Shmuel thinks, don't tell me there's primary and secondary. This is a Babylonian rabbi. The other two were land of Israel rabbis. This Babylonian rabbi is saying, you have a primary obligation or an equal obligation to say Havdalah twice, once at home, he doesn't say why, and once in tefillah, twice, period, ikara kan v'kan, kan v'kan. Okay. So these rabbis are struggling. I think they're struggling with why are we doing Havdalah twice? And they're trying to differentiate, at least the middle guy here is trying to differentiate between the Havdalah you say at home, the Havdalah you say in prayer. And as Rabbi Yochanan, he seems to be downplaying the Havdalah in at home. No, I'm getting this wrong. No, I'm sorry. Rabbi Yochanan is saying the Havdalah at home is the primary obligation. And, we don't really know how to do it in tefillah. People have forgotten. I don't know exactly what that means. All right. So there's a tension here about Havdalah. How many times are we going to say it? And if we're going to say it in tefillah, where are we going to say it? We've got a Talmudic dispute, like whom do we decide? And we're doing it at home for what purpose? And so on. Okay, that is Talmud Yerushalmi. Now we get to the Talmud Bavli, and if you compare Talmud Bavli, I left out deliberately part of it. It's a much longer discussion of this very same topic in the Talmud Bavli. So now we're going to H5. All right. So the Mishnah is quoted, a different part of the Mishnah, doesn't matter. And I'm going to the second line there. Amar le Rav Shemin bar Abba le Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, we've got the same Rabbi Yochanan. He's a land of Israel rabbi. His opinions often appear in the Babylonian Talmud. He's one of the most talkative rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud. And he says the following, Michti, that's just an expletive. Now look, oh, did I skip something? No, I'm sorry. Rabbi Shimon ben Abba is asking the following question. He's saying to Rabbi Yochanan, look, Anshe Knesset Havdalah, the men of the great assembly. Now, that is a phrase that appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi, by the way, and a number of times in the Talmud Bavli. And it's some kind of reference, it's in Pirkei Avot too. It's a reference to early authorities. No names, we don't know, we know a little bit about them. In other words, we know what the Talmud says about them. We don't have any factual anything, if you like that. But, did Rabbi Yochanan live? Did Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel live? It seems like they did because we have so many statements attributed to them. But here they're saying these early rabbis, the men of the great assembly, Tiknu lahem Yisrael, they instituted for the Jewish people, and here's a list: brachot, blessings, tefillot, prayers, kiddushot. That's not kedusha. Kiddushot means kiddush, and havdalah, kiddush and havdalah. So it's like, wow, these early authorities about whom we know very little, and we don't know at which time period we're talking about either, but prior to the Talmudic period, my goodness, they gave us a sidur. One is basically what's saying here. Blessings, prayers, kiddush, havdalah, it all, they are the authors of all these things. But the question, the point now is, nechazeh hechi hechan tikun. Where did they put it? What had I read? Where did they insert it? Meaning the question is about Havdalah. It's a broad statement, but it's the question is being asked by Rabbi Shimon ben Abba. He's saying, I know these rituals are all very old, but tell me, where did those early authorities insert the Havdalah? Meaning, why do we have Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer and then the first unnamed Tana? Why is there this dispute if these prayers are so old and they go back to whenever these people lived on Sheikh Knesset Havdalah? Why don't we just look and see where they put Havdalah in the Ma'ariv, and we'll know. We don't have to have a dispute. So Rabbi Yochanan answers, Amarle, B'tchila kavuha b'tfilah. At first, these men of the Great Assembly, they inserted Havdalah into the Amidah, into Tfilah, prayer. He'eshiru, the people grew rich, meaning the economic situation improved. Kva'uha ala kos, meaning now that people could afford to buy wine, although I do want to remind you, wine was cheap in those days, much cheaper than relative, everything is relative, much cheaper than it would be today. Today, Coca-Cola is a lot cheaper than wine. And back then, date beer may have been the cheapest and wine was not expensive relative to other things. So when the people grew richer, these men, they moved Havdalah from Tfilah onto the cup of wine, meaning a home ritual. Knew, but when the economic situation worsened, they became aniyim, they became poor. Chazru v'kavuha b'tfilah. Then these men of the Great Assembly, again, this is all very vague. They put Havdalah back in Tfilah. V'hema, and so the question this Rav Shimon bar Abba had asked is, why do we have a dispute? And the answer is, what is the answer here? That the Havdalah is going back and forth. And when it's going back and forth, people can forget things. Let me try to make this even more clear. I've been saying, recite Havdalah twice, once in Tfilah and once at home on a cup of wine. But this answer that Rabbi Yochanan is giving is basically saying, at any given moment in Jewish history, in very early Jewish history, you either recited Havdalah in prayer, when you could not afford to have wine. Then when you could afford to have wine at home, Havdalah shifted to home. And then when you could no longer afford to have wine at home, Havdalah shifted back to Tfilah. All right. And that is supposed to be an answer to where did they put it? And the answer is, when they were saying it at home, this is like the Yerushalmi, they probably forgot where to put it in Tfilah. There's like gaps. But now what's important to me is what's coming next. V'heim amru, the same men of the Great Assembly said, amru often means legislated, hamavdil b'tfilah, tzarich sheyavdil al hakos. If you're going to, he who recites Havdalah in prayer service also needs to recite Havdalah on a cup of wine. All right, now I have to move quickly now. I'll talk more about that in just a moment, but let me just show you. That was the first time you saw those words, that if you recite it in Tefillah, you also have to recite it on a cup. First time in the Babylonian Talmud. If you go down to the very next paragraph, you can see, I'm not going to read it, but you can see at the very end I wrote, V'hem amru, and the same men of the Great Assembly said, if you say Havdalah in prayer, you have to say it on a cup. Now go down to the next text. This is Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef. Up until now, it was Rabbi Yochanan, and from the land of Israel, talking about Havdalah, saying, say it twice in prayer and at home on a cup of wine. And now you have Babylonian rabbis, Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef, third generation, a little bit later than Rabbi Yochanan. And they say the same thing that he says, it's like I'm beginning to get a headache, so to speak. How many times do you have to tell me this? Okay, and then we go to the next paragraph, and we're back in the land of Israel. We have Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet. He asked Rabbi Yossi, who asked Rabbi Yochanan, the same question, what's going on here? And this Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet, he's third generation Jerusalem Amora, he says, Sham'it, I heard Rabbi Yochanan answer the person who asked him the question about Havdalah, and the answer was, Amarle, at the end of it, there's the question, I'm skipping the question, Tzarich sheyavdil al hakos. If you say Havdalah and Tefillah, you got to say it also on a cup. And finally, okay, Amarle Ravina LaRava, we're in the late Babylonian generations now. Rava is fourth generation. There were two Ravinas. This is the earlier Ravina of the fifth generation. And he says to Rava, so what's the halacha? Meaning he too probably has heard it again and again and again, so to speak, ad nauseum. How many times are you going to tell me that hamavdil b'tfilah tzarich sheyavdil al hakos? And the answer here is going to be different. His answer is ma kiddush afal gavda makadesh b'tzlota makadesh akasa. Okay, we moved into Aramaic away from Hebrew. I think it's to draw our attention to it. Of course, there's a lot of Aramaic in the Babylonian Talmud. Af Havdalah nami afal gavda mavdil al b'tzlota mavdil akasa. This is a very important statement. In the same way that Kiddush is recited in prayer, Ma'ariv, that central blessing, Mekadesh Shabbat, Kiddush is recited in Slota, in prayer, and Mekadesh Kasa on a cup of wine at home. Havdalah too, Afal Gavda Mavdil, but Slota Mavdil Kasa. Same thing with Havdalah. You say it in prayer, you're going to say it at home on a cup of wine. So now if you say to yourself, what? 5 times over? The same Babylonia section, Sugya, had to tell me that if you say Havdalah and Tefillah, you also have to say it on a cup. And my answer is as follows, because I was struck by this. I really could not understand. Can anybody out there, write to me if you can, show me another Sugya in the Babylonian Talmud where the same halacha is repeated. I actually showed you 5 times over, but I left out another 2. It's actually repeated 7 times over. So the first thing I want to say is if they have to repeat it that many times, it means the people, the first couple of times, it wasn't accepted. It didn't sink in. Or you might say the first couple of times, they're bringing it in from the land of Israel, but only on the 3rd time do we actually have Babylonian rabbis. Again, I can't tell you for sure what's going on here. I can just say it's a little bit wild to have the same halacha repeated so many times over. But the thing that I find very interesting is the first 2 times there's a reference made to the men of the Great Assembly, okay, which, as I say, we know very little about them. I could give you a list of what they've done, the other references, but there's no time for that. So by the time you get to the 3rd repetition, by the time you get to Rabbah and Rav Yosef, the Babylonian rabbis, they're no longer talking about men of the Great Assembly. The question before them is, if you say Havdalah and Tefillah, do you also have to say it on a cup? And this makes sense to me. Havdalah back then was a declaration, Sabbath has ended. Okay, I'll daven Mariv, and I'll add a statement in the 4th blessing, the Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol and so on. There are 4 or 5 statements there. I'll add it to my Amida. Why do I have to come home and say it all over again? If I've said Shabbos is over, I've declared it, I've exited the sanctity. What am I doing at home all over again? All right. So no, that's the question that's in front of them. Why say it twice? So these rabbis, they're struggling with that. Why are we doing Havdalah twice? Now, in the Jerusalem Talmud, that middle rabbi, the middle of 3 rabbis, he said, oh, you're doing it at home for the people at home, and then you're doing it in shul, or doesn't matter in shul or not in shul. When you pray, you're saying it because you have an obligation to say it. In the Babylonian Talmud, they don't say it quite like that, but they drop reference to the men of the Great Assembly, starting with the 3rd answer to the question, do you have to say Havdalah twice? So the first 2, it's yes, you do, and that's what these men told you have to do. Starting with the 3rd, it's yes, you do. The 4th, yes, you do. And the 4th is again Rabbi Yochanan, but there's no reference in this Rabbi Yochanan's citation of Rabbi Yochanan to these men of the Great Assembly. And then finally, in the Babylonian Talmud, they depart totally from all of that, men of the Great Assembly and this and that. It's yes. You know why we say Havdalah twice? Because Kiddush, these are the bookends, right? Kiddush is the welcoming the Sabbath, acknowledging the Sabbath, sanctity, experiencing the sanctity. And Havdalah is helping you walk out of the sanctity. And you're going to say it. Oh, so you're going to say it. Okay. I got caught in my own words. You say it once, that should be enough. But Rava is answering Ravina. You're going to say it twice because we really want to keep the parallel structure. We want to keep Kiddush like Havdalah. Just as Kiddush is recited twice in the synagogue or in the prayer service and at home on a cup of wine, that's what you're going to do with Havdalah, period. Does there have to be logic to this, to saying the end of sanctity, acknowledging? No, there doesn't have to be logic, but there's something beautiful about this, that we're, Sabbath is like a bubble in time. We're entering the sanctity with words, and then we're going to exit the sanctity again with words. And just as we entered it in 2 ways, prayer and on a cup of wine at home, we're going to do the same thing at the exit of the Havdalah. Now, I see that I have to make a choice right now between number 6 and number 7. I'm going to choose number 7 because this is a very famous sugya, and I see I don't have time to read all of it because I want to leave Q&A. So let me just say that in H7, the last text here, the question is, the Mishnah seems to be allowing people at the end of the Sabbath to perform labor prior to saying Havdalah. And up until now, there was no statement that until you say Havdalah, you can't perform labor. So that's the question that has arisen here. And it's actually a very interesting question. Is Havdalah merely a declaration of the end of Sabbath sanctity, which there's no time for this, but if you're eating a meal late Sabbath, unlike what you have to do Friday, which is stop short and say Kiddush when Sabbath begins, oh, you're eating a meal at the end of Sabbath? Keep eating, keep eating. You don't have to say Havdalah the minute the Sabbath ends. That's kind of insulting the Sabbath. Just when you're done, and when you're ready. As a matter of fact, you can say Havdalah up until Wednesday, through Tuesday, up until Wednesday. That's, of course, you're supposed to say Saturday night, but if you forgot to or couldn't, or whatever. So Havdalah is similar to Kiddush, but it's also different from Kiddush. But the thing that I'm trying to say right now is, because I want to summarize the subject for you and complete it, conclude what I'm saying. Havdalah has a function, a real function, in addition to simply declaring the end of Sabbath. So I'm just going to read the last 2 parts here, the last Hebrew section of H7. Amarle Abba Rav Ashi. It's the one before the last. Okay. No, I'm not being fair to you. Let me just go back up a little bit. you see the Mishnah, and then you see aval machshichin, and then the third paragraph, v'afagav. In the English, it begins, Stam, anonymous editor asks, may he perform? I'm going to read the English this time. May he perform labor when the Sabbath ends if he has not yet recited Havdalah? Okay, question. Did not Rabbi Elazar Rabbi ben Antigonus, Jerusalem Amora, say in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, who's a very late Tana, a person is prohibited from attending to his needs, that is, performing labor after the Sabbath ends, until he recites Havdalah. This is something brand new. Up until the time that this late Tana said that, and then it's transmitted by an Amora a little bit later, up until the time, it's like, okay, acknowledge the end of the Sabbath, but you could do it now, you could do it later. It's okay, Sabbath has ended. And now they're saying, you know something? You're not allowed, I'll use the example, you're not allowed to strike a match when the Sabbath is over until you say Havdalah. Okay, is this pressure to say Havdalah? Of course. But it's a new way of looking, it's a new development in the history of Havdalah. It functions as a barrier, a gatekeeper. You can't get on with your life at the end of the Sabbath until you say Havdalah. Now, having said that, I'm now going to the last two Hebrew statements here. Amar le Rabbi Abba le Rav Ashi b'ma'arava. Okay, Rabbi Abba is from the land of Israel, but he's visiting Babylon, and he says to Rav Ashi, prominent rabbi, b'ma'arava, that's in the west, in the land of Israel, Amrinan Hachi. This is what we say at the end of Sabbath. Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, we say an abbreviated Havdalah, just 4 words, v'avdinan tzorchin, and we perform our needs, we attend to our needs, meaning we perform labor. This line, Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, and by the way, the next line is actually the same thing, so I won't read the next line. I'm going to try to just wrap up right now. This is a very interesting development that persists until this very day. In other words, Shabbos is over. I can see it's dark outside, and I've left my oven on, on my Shabbos setting, the entire Shabbos, but it's hot, and I want to turn it off. But I don't know. I'm not ready to say Havdalah. I don't have it organized. So all anybody has to say after Shabbos ends, not before Shabbos ends, but after sundown, consult your calendars. It has all the information for you. Hebcal, HEBCAL.org. All you have to say when the Sabbath is over is the 4 words, Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, God who distinguishes between holiness and weekdays, ordinary days, and you can just go over and turn your stove off, or write a letter, or do whatever you want to do at the end of Sabbath. Meaning, you can't just slide from the Sabbath into performing labor. You've got to say these words. So Havdalah, that's not what it used to be. It used to be, as I said, you can recite Havdalah as late as Tuesday afternoon. But here they're saying at the end of Shabbos, that's the full Havdalah. At the end of Shabbos, if you want to do something that's not Shabbosdik, that's labor, just say the 4 words, Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol. And this is a well-known rule out there among people who are Havdalah sayers. They just do this 1, 2, 3. And what these rabbis are doing, my final comment is, they're not home. They're with their mentor at the end of the Sabbath. And the mentor wants them to chop wood for him. So they're in a bind. They know that they're supposed to say Havdalah in prayer and at home for the members of the family before work is performed, okay? But their teacher wants them right away. So they invented, at this point in time, this new short Havdalah, this abbreviated 4-word Havdalah. So when you are not home and you need to say Havdalah because either you need to do work for yourself or for somebody else, you just say these 4 words, and when you go home, full Havdalah for the people at home. Okay, I think I've made my, I hope I've demonstrated to you that Havdalah evolved over time. There are many other ways it evolved, but I think it would be unfair to me to keep talking because there probably are questions. So I will end it at that and say, these are 2 amazing rituals, Kiddush and Havdalah, the bookends of the Sabbath, that began as simply ways to acknowledge the entrance of the Sabbath, acknowledge the exit of the Sabbath, but they evolved into much more than that. Questions, Julia?
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to synthesize not exactly the questions because there are too many, but sort of the larger theme that I'm seeing among them, which is right, I think your point is, Shabbat, it starts when it starts and it ends when it ends, although there are whole discussions about that too, but these rituals are about lifting up those borders. It's not, they don't just pass. So here's the question. Those are moments in time, right? Like, meaning Kiddush happened, you do Kiddush when you do Kiddush. It happened, it didn't, you hadn't done it before, now you did it, and now you have that lovely Shabbat feeling, and then, and then it sort of departs after you make Havdalah. And yet there's actually all this murkiness about these times. You can bring Shabbat in early, right? Like my shul starts Shabbat services at 6:45 now. You can, as you just said, make Havdalah on Tuesday. So it's interesting that that there's so much attention paid to rituals to really define this for us, when there seems to also be, sort of flexibility, questions, debates about when Shabbat actually starts and ends.
Well, no, I think you've already included your answer, or the answer to the questions, in the way you formulated the questions. We know when Shabbat begins. Sunset is, the Shabbat begins at sunset on Friday. Shabbat exits on sunset on Saturday. What have we now developed? Oh, we're going to light candles 20 minutes before because we need that margin of safety. Because if you're going to light candles, 1 minute before sunset, you're going to make a mistake and you're going to violate the Sabbath. And what do we do at the end of the Sabbath? We add 40 minutes to sundown. Why do we add 40 minutes to sundown? That's Shabbos is not over until 40 minutes after sundown, lest we end it too early and so on. That's why it's now 25 hours. That's how it's easy for you to remember. You add 20 minutes here and 40 minutes there. Instead of a 24-hour Sabbath, you have a 25-hour. We know when Sabbath begins and ends, but they're giving you a lot of flexibility. We now live, there are northern countries and there are southern countries, and I have a son on the West Coast, and Shabbos begins in Berkeley, California around 45 minutes. I don't remember exactly, or in Los Angeles, around 45 minutes later. I think the same is true. Atlanta is even clearer. Atlanta is in the west of the time zone, that same time zone we're in. So, they begin Shabbos later than we begin Shabbos. It's the same Shabbos for them, but they're 25 hours and not the same 25 hours, even you're in the same time zone. So yeah, there's a sense that it's going to affect different people differently. And I love the idea that, yeah, you can begin Shabbos early. Children want to eat early, and old people want to eat early. And yeah, but there's a limit that you can't begin Shabbos at 2 p.m. on Friday. They give you roughly an hour and a quarter, let's say, to begin Shabbos early. And even though Havdalah can be said as late as Tuesday, that's the ritual. Okay, you better just say those 4 words if you want to go about your business. So the borderlines are somewhat blurry, but they're not as blurry as Shabbos continues until Tuesday. That's just, a detail that, okay, I can't even imagine under what circumstances. Well, let's say you didn't have wine. Okay, and there's a story in the Talmud. They're wonderful anecdotes. Can't bring, as I said before, email me if you have any further questions that I don't answer today, or if you have comments on the lecture or whatever, you can. And I always say to people, I'll put you in a footnote. If what you ask me gets into the final version, I acknowledge in a footnote. That's the incentive, of course, to write to me and to help me out with this. But yes, I just think that kind of flexibility, that murkiness, is a very positive trait, and it's a built-in trait, I think. And they even talk about, does Shabbos begin for the woman who lights the candles when she lights the candles, or when she hears Baruch Hu coming, into her window from the shul next door? And it gets complicated. The basic answer is, you light those candles, you've begun Shabbos. If you didn't light the candles, you have more time, up until the last minute. I hope that answers the question, but I just love the idea that it's all over the place.
You did answer the question, and it's making me, I'm reflecting on the session we had last week on Benish Mashot with Dr. Sarika Tan-Gribitz, but really on the whole series. that we talked with Bina Shot about how it's kind of a generative and yet very anxious, fearful time, sort of both in the sources. And maybe you can say that about all of the kind of in-between spaces and times and identities that we've been talking about over the course of this semester, that they open up possibilities. They're also sort of unknown and scary. And these rituals, especially these rituals that involve light, that involve wine, they're sort of an anchor, and they clarify for a moment. Here's where you are. Here's where you're coming from. Here's where you're going. So they sort of help us navigate those transitions from one space or time into the next. Thank you so much for teaching us today. It's lovely to have you back, and especially, for this to be the first thing you do the day after your 80th birthday.
Yes.
We're honored. I want to thank everyone for coming, and again, thank our wonderful sponsors, Steph and Mary Krieger, who sponsored today in memory of their teacher, Rabbi Max Tickton, Marlene Kassler-Kursan, in honor of Lynn Feynman and the team here at JTS, and Rana and Brian Rogel in honor of Dr. Hauptman and her influence on them and on all of us. So we hope to see all of you back in a couple of weeks for our next series. And I feel like I have to end with a pun. I hope you enjoy the space in between now and then, this little moment without JTS learning. And we look forward to continuing with you on June 5th. Thanks so much for learning with us, everyone.